In less than 2 weeks, a major trade deadline could reshape Europe's relationship with the United States. On July 9th, new tariffs of up to 50% are set to take effect on European exports unless the EU and the US reach a deal. The pressure is centered on digital regulation, specifically Europe's Digital Markets Act, which Washington argues unfairly targets American tech companies. At stake is more than just tariffs. This is about how two of the world's largest economies manage trade, regulate digital platforms, and respond to political pressure. Talks are ongoing, but divisions remain deep on both sides. Today, we're looking at how we got here, what's happening behind the scenes, and what this deadline could mean for trade, tech, and transatlantic cooperation. For most of the last 4 years, trade between the United States and the European Union has operated under a patchwork of elevated duties: a flat 10% tariff on almost all European goods, a 25% levy on cars and parts, and a steep 50% charge on steel and aluminium. The EU bristled at the numbers but treated them as the cost of doing business with Washington, hoping that diplomacy, or a change of mood in the White House, would eventually unwind the surcharges. That hope collapsed on the 2nd of April 2025, the day the Trump administration dubbed Liberation Day. From a podium at the Port of Baltimore, the president warned that the baseline 10% rate was merely a starting point. If Brussels did not bend on tech regulation and other non-tariff barriers, all European exports could face duties of up to 50%. The prospect of an across-the-board hike stunned EU capitals already grappling with war in Ukraine, a slowing economy, and a fractious security debate. In the weeks that followed, negotiators shuttled between Washington and Brussels without visible progress. Then, on 23 June, an unexpected signal emerged from the European Commission's daily press briefing. Asked whether the Union's flagship Digital Markets Act was still off-limits in the talks, Commission spokesperson Thomas Renier replied that nothing is off the table, adding that the goal was a fair and balanced deal. His comment marked the first public hint that Brussels might be willing to discuss carve-outs for U.S. tech giants if it meant averting the tariff spike. Business lobbies were already sounding alarms. In Berlin, the president of the German Federation of Industries, Peter Liebinger, told reporters that extra tariffs could shave about 0.3 of a percentage point off Germany's GDP, a heavy blow for a manufacturing sector still below its pre-crisis output. Smaller member states, meanwhile, worried that even a temporary standstill clause might simply postpone, not prevent, a trade war. That is the path that has led to the present standoff. Less than 2 weeks remain before the 9th of July deadline. Europe must now decide whether to adjust its own digital rulebook to placate Washington, risk a damaging tariff barrage, or negotiate yet another stopgap truce that postpones hard choices. However the next few days unfold, they will be judged against this sequence of tariff escalations, political pressure points, and a single offhand remark that opened the door to rewriting a law once thought untouchable. Things took a sharp turn when a leaked document, first reported by the Wall Street Journal, exposed what the U.S. is really asking for in these negotiations. At the center of the request is Europe's Digital Markets Act, or DMA. This law was passed to stop big online platforms, especially US-based tech giants, from abusing their market dominance in Europe. It sets strict rules on how companies like Apple, Google, Meta, and Amazon operate within the EU. But now the US wants carve-outs. In simple terms, they're asking for exceptions, special treatment for American firms. They're also pushing back against the EU's carbon border tax, which puts environmental tariffs on goods from countries with weaker climate rules. That hits U.S. steel chemicals and manufacturing in a big way. The leak caused immediate backlash in Brussels. Some officials were furious. One prominent voice, a French lawmaker closely tied to the DMA, called the idea of suspending the law an unacceptable capitulation. She warned that if Europe starts rewriting its own rules just because the U.S. applies pressure, it opens the door for similar demands from other countries in the future. But not everyone in Europe sees it that way. Inside closed-door meetings, EU negotiators are exploring something they call a standstill clause. This would be a temporary deal. The EU agrees to delay enforcement of certain rules, like DMA provisions, and in return the US agrees not to raise tariffs any further for at least 6 months. Supporters of this approach say it's a smart way to buy time. They argue that with the threat of 50% tariffs hanging over key industries like cars, wine, and machinery, Europe needs to show flexibility. Critics, however, see it differently. They say this is the start of a dangerous trend where economic threats shape regulatory decisions. If a foreign government can get around EU law by threatening tariffs, it could undermine the entire idea of Europe as an independent rule setter. What makes this moment even more sensitive is the symbolism. The DMA was meant to show that Europe can stand up to big tech and lead the way on global regulation. Delaying or softening it, even slightly, would be a major political reversal. At the same time, the US knows exactly how much leverage it holds. The threat of tariffs is doing its job. It's creating division inside Europe, where some countries prioritize protecting their export industries while others want to defend the integrity of EU law. So now the question becomes, will Europe hold the line on its digital rules or fold under pressure to protect its economy? The answer might come down to whether Brussels thinks this tariff threat is a real long-term risk or just another Trump negotiation tactic. Either way, with the deadline fast approaching, these next few days could decide whether the EU sticks to its principles or compromises to avoid a trade war. The divide inside Europe is growing deeper by the day, and the July 9th deadline is only making those internal tensions harder to ignore. While officials publicly talk about unity, the reality is that EU member states are quietly splitting into different camps, each with their own priorities, their own pressures, and their own view of how to handle the United States. On one side are the countries that want a quick deal. Germany is leading this group, backed by others like Ireland and the Netherlands. Their concern is practical. Their economies are deeply tied to exports, and any new tariffs, especially ones as high as 50%, would hit them hard. German automakers are already under pressure, and the idea of another tariff shock could push some industries over the edge. From this camp's point of view, it's better to make a few concessions now than risk major economic damage later. They don't want to scrap Europe's tech laws entirely, but they're open to temporary adjustments, just enough to calm the situation and keep trade flowing. Then there's the hardline camp. This group includes countries like France, Spain, and many members of the European Parliament, especially from the Greens and the left. Their argument is rooted in principle. If Europe gives in to US pressure now, it sends the message that its laws can be rewritten by foreign threats. They say this isn't just a trade issue, it's about sovereignty. If the EU backs off its Digital Markets Act today, what stops the US or any other country from demanding changes to climate policy, data privacy, or tax rules tomorrow? From their perspective, standing firm, even if it triggers a trade war, is the only way to protect the long-term credibility of EU regulation. There's also a third group. Not as loud, but quietly influential. These are the countries closest to Russia, like Lithuania, Estonia, and others in Central and Eastern Europe. Their main concern isn't digital policy or exports, it's security. For them, keeping the US close means keeping American weapons, intelligence, and military support flowing. They worry that a breakdown in trade talks could spill over into defense ties. They're willing to tolerate some economic discomfort if it helps preserve the broader transatlantic relationship, especially as tensions with Russia remain high. But they also don't want to see the EU break apart from within, and they fear that a messy split over tariffs and tech rules could weaken the bloc just when unity is most needed. So the choice facing Europe isn't just whether to compromise or hold firm. It's also about how to balance these internal pressures, how to protect key industries without undermining EU law, how to defend sovereignty without damaging transatlantic ties, and how to present a united front when not everyone agrees on what unity should look like. These divisions aren't new, but the tariff deadline is forcing them into the open. Over the next few days, we'll likely see more public statements, more last-minute meetings, and more positioning from each camp. Some leaders will push for calm and flexibility, others will demand strength and resistance. But underneath all of it is a deeper question. Can the EU act as one, or will this be another moment where national interests take priority over shared strategy? The answer could shape how the world sees Europe, not just as a trading partner, but as a political force in an increasingly competitive global system. This story isn't just about tariffs or trade, it's about something much bigger. What's playing out right now between the US and the EU has serious long-term consequences for how rules are made, who gets to enforce them, and whether Europe can continue to shape global standards in the digital age. Start with tech governance. Over the past few years, the European Union has made a deliberate push to become the world's rule setter when it comes to regulating big tech. The Digital Markets Act is the centerpiece of that strategy. It's meant to hold powerful tech platforms accountable, prevent monopolistic behavior, and give European businesses and consumers a fairer digital environment. But if the EU agrees to delay or dilute parts of that law just to ease tensions with Washington, it sends a clear message, not only to the United States, but to every multinational company watching closely. The rules aren't fixed, and with enough pressure, they can be changed. That kind of signal could weaken the entire foundation of EU competition policy. Companies might begin to question how stable Europe's regulatory environment really is, and for smaller EU member states, who often rely on the Commission to shield them from global giants, that loss of credibility would be deeply damaging. Then there's the issue of defense autonomy. For countries on the EU's eastern flank, especially the Baltic states, the transatlantic relationship isn't just about economics, it's about security. They depend heavily on US military support, both in terms of equipment and strategic deterrence. And while trade disputes might seem like a separate arena, these governments worry that a prolonged standoff could affect defense cooperation. If relations between Brussels and Washington sour, and Europe retaliates with its own tariffs, that tension could carry over into NATO discussions or joint defense planning. In a moment where Russia remains aggressive and unpredictable, even a slight chill in US-EU defense coordination could create real vulnerabilities on Europe's eastern border. So for these countries, the stakes go far beyond trade, they're about survival. Finally, there's the question of global norm setting. The EU has positioned itself as a leader in shaping the rules of the road in emerging areas like digital privacy, environmental standards, and artificial intelligence. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, became a global benchmark for data privacy. The EU's carbon border tax is pushing other countries to rethink how emissions are priced and accounted for. And new laws on AI governance are already influencing discussions in tech hubs from Silicon Valley to Seoul. But all of that influence depends on one thing: consistency. If the EU backs off under pressure now, especially on something as symbolic as the Digital Markets Act, it could open the door for more bargaining down the road. Climate policy might be next, or digital identity, or any number of areas where global companies and powerful governments would prefer looser rules. The bigger risk is that the EU begins to look like a negotiable force rather than a principled one. In short, what happens in these next few days doesn't just decide whether tariffs go up or down. It could redefine Europe's position in the world, its ability to protect its laws, to defend its values, and to lead in shaping what the global economy looks like over the next decade. That's why these talks matter. That's why the rest of the world is watching.